He was one of the country's most notorious murderers, a cold-blooded killer.
To the monster who killed Peter Falconio.
I heard a bang, and then he put a gun to my head.
British tourists Peter Falconio and Joanne Lees were ambushed just north of Barrow Creek on the Stuart Highway.
It was the night of 14th July 2001. Peter Falconio, a 28 years old British backpacker, and his girlfriend Joanna Lees were driving their orange Volkswagen Combi van through the darkness, and they were heading towards Darwin. They had spent months exploring Australian beaches, forests, and some small beautiful country towns. These couple were chasing the adventure that every traveler dreams of. But on this lonely stretch of road, near a roadhouse called Barrow Creek, adventure was about to turn into a nightmare. Because sometime after 8 p.m, headlights appeared behind them. Another vehicle, a white utility truck, flashed its lights and signaled them to pull over. Peter slowed down and stopped on the side of the road. The desert was absolute silent, except for the low hum of the van's engine and the faint hum of the insects in the night. Joanna sat still in the passenger seat, watching as Peter stepped out to see what the driver wanted. That's it. Within few seconds, she heard a loud bang, then silence. No shouting, no footsteps, just the wind. Before she could even react, a man appeared at her window, ordering her out at a gunpoint. He tied her hands, forced her towards his vehicle, but somehow, in this chaos, Joanna fight back. She wiggled free, ran into the blackness of the bush, and disappeared into the desert night barefoot. Terrified and hiding among the bushes while the man haunted her with a dog and a flashlight. For 5 long hours, she crouched into the darkness, heart pounding, afraid to breathe. The sound of the engine faded, the lights vanished. Only then she did dare to move. Just past midnight, a truck passed by, its headlighting slicing through the emptiness. Joanna stumbled onto the road, waving her hand tied, crying for help, and saying, "My boyfriend has been shot." She told the driver he is gone. When police reached the scene, there were no sign of Peter Falconio. No body, no footprints, nothing but a terrified survivor and a miles of an endless desert. And from that night onwards till today, one question Australia needs to answer. What really happened to Peter Falconio? This is his story. Before that night in the desert, there were smiles, postcards, and plans for the future for both Peter and Joanna. The couple had left England months earlier, chasing adventure on the other side of the world in Australia, the land of freedom, road trips, and open skies. Peter was 28, born in Huddersfield, Yorkshire. He was outgoing, confident, the kind of a man who made friends easily. He loved to travel with loud music, old cars, the feeling of the road stretching endlessly ahead. While on the other hand, Joanna was 27 from Sheffield. She was quiet, intelligent, and focused. She worked in an office before deciding to pack her life into a backpack and follow Peter to the other end of the planet. She loved photography, books, and small amounts, not just the thrill of an adventure, but what it meant to live it together. This couple met in the late 90s, fell in love fast, and within a few years, they have saved enough money for a trip of a lifetime. The plan was very simple: buy a van, travel across the country, and experience everything Australia had to offer, from Sydney's beaches to the vast red deserts of the Northern Territory. For months, the dream was real. They surfed along the Gold Coast, camped under the stars, and sent email homes filled with excitement. Friends described them as an inseparable, a couple that seemed built for the road. Every photo from those days looked like freedom, hair blowing in the wind, sunset behind them, and an orange Volkswagen Combi parked somewhere in the wild. But behind those smiles were tiny cracks, had begun to form. Travel can bond two peoples or test them. Jonah's letter home hinted at moments of frustration. Peter could be restless, impulsive, while she was practical, organized. They argued about money, routes, even music, but none of it seemed serious enough to matter. Just the natural friction of two people living every moment side by side. By the time they reached the Northern Territory in mid July 2001, they would have driven thousands of kilometers. Darwin was the next destination, the final stretch before they would loop back down through the Western Australia. Neither of them knew that something on the long highway fate was already waiting. They stopped for fuel, grabbed snack, jokes about how endless the desert felt. Jonah later remembered Peter laughing, saying, "It's like driving on Mars." It was their last moment together. Hours later, the Outback swallowed him, and the life they would build together would vanish within minutes. It was a Saturday night, 14th July 2001. The stars over the Northern Territory were brighter than most people would ever see in their lifetime. For travelers, the Outback has a strange beauty, which is endless, peaceful, and terrifyingly quiet. Peter and Jonah were driving north along the Seward Highway, a long and lonely road that stretches thousands of kilometers through the heart of Australia. They had been behind the wheel for hours. The fuel gauge was dropping, but they were in no rush because Darwin was only a few days away. At 7:45 p.m., they passed the Barrow Creek Roadhouse, a small town surrounded by nothing but desert. The temperature had begun to fall. Peter kept his hand on the wheel, humming along the stereo. Jonah was reading a magazine by torchlight, half asleep. Minutes later, she noticed headlights in the mirror. A white utility truck speeding up, then slowing down. It followed them for several kilometers, almost too close. Then it flashed its high beam once, twice, and again. Peter thought the driver might be signaling a mechanical problem, maybe a loose exhaust or something wrong with the van. It slowed down and pulled over the dusky shoulder. The road was silent. No other cars inside, just two vehicles and the desert around them. Jonah remembered Peter saying something like, "I will see what he wants." He stepped out, leaving the driver's door open. That was the last time she ever saw him alive. Seconds later, a gunshot echoed through the still night. Jonah froze. Her body refused to move. The sound was sharp, quiet, and final. He pointed a gun directly at her and shouted her to get out. Her hands trembled as he tied them behind her back with what felt like a rough tape or rope. He forced her towards his vehicle, yelling orders she would barely process. Jonah's heart pounded in the ears, louder than his voice, louder than the wind. But survival has its own instinct, right? When he turned for a moment, she ran blindly into the blankness. The ground was uneven, covered in rocks and dry grass. The cold air had cut her skin. She kept running until her legs gave out, then crawled behind a bush, hiding, listening, gasping for air. The man wasn't gone. She could hear his footsteps. The sound of a dog barking, closer, then fading again. A beam light from a flashlight swept across the sand, searching. Jonah pressed her face into the dirt, terrified that even her breath would give her away. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like forever. At one point, she heard the engine start. The truck moved slowly, then drove away, but she didn't trust it. She stayed hidden for nearly 5 hours, alone, tired, shivering, waiting for morning that never seemed to come. Finally, around 12:30 a.m., she heard a distant rumble of a diesel truck. Headlights broke the horizon, two beams cutting through the dark. She stumbled out on the highway, waving, shouting for help. When the truck driver stopped, she screamed the words that would soon make the headlines around the world. My boyfriend has been shot and he's gone. She was hysterical, shaking, barely able to speak. The driver pulled her into the cabin, locked the doors, and radioed police. By the time police reached the scene, Peter Falconio had vanished, as if the Outback itself had swallowed him whole. There was no body, no gun, no signs of struggle except a few drops of blood on the van and the rough marks on Jonah's wrist. From that moment, the mystery began, a mystery that would divide Australia, question witnesses, and haunt investigators for years. When the police first arrived on that lonely stretch of the Seward Highway in the early hours of 15 July 2001, they were met with confusion because there was no body, no weapon, no footprints beyond marks Jonah had been running for her life. The van's hazard light was still blinking. The driver's door hung open. Inside, officer found bloodstains near the handbrake. A small smear later confirmed to be Peter Falconio's DNA. But beyond that, there was almost nothing. No shell casing, no drag marks, no sign of Peter had gone. It was as if the desert had swallowed him whole. The Northern Territory Police immediately launched a full-scale search. Helicopters, trackers, and dozens of officers combed the red sand for days. They searched drains, wells, roadways across hundreds of kilometers, and they found absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, Jonah was taken to Alice Springs for questioning, exhausted, dehydrated, and still in shock. She struggled to retell what happened, but instead of sympathy, she was met with something else, which is doubt. Detective questioned her for hours. Some wondered if her story was added up. How could she escape, they asked, when the attacker had a gun and a dog? Why was there no physical evidence, and where was Peter's body? The case quickly exploded into headlines. In the absence of the body, the public and the parts of media began to turn on Jonah. Talk show called her the Outback Mystery Woman. But through all the noise, one thing stayed consistent. Her account never changed. Every detail she gave about the attacker, the car, and the night itself remained the same. She described him as a man in the mid-30s or 40s, tall with long hair tied back, driving a white four-wheel drive utility truck. Then a small clue emerged and it changed everything. Police retrieved Jonah's clothing for forensic testing. On a t-shirt and the restraints used to tie her hands, they found a DNA that did not belong to Peter. It was from another male. The lab results went into national database, and weeks later there was a match. The name that came back was Bradley John Murdoch. Bradley was already known to police, a mechanic and a long-haul truck driver from Broome, Western Australia. He had a violent temper, a history of carrying weapons, and the deep ties to the criminal underworld through drug smuggling. He also drove, according to multiple witnesses, a white Toyota utility truck, almost identical to the one Jonah described. As police pieced it together, they began to realize the horrifying possibility. Bradley might have been cruising the Outback that night, armed, paranoid, and looking for trouble. The search for Peter was now becoming a hunt for Bradley, and the first crack in the mystery was finally visible. But the biggest question still remained. If Bradley was the killer, where was the Peter's body? When police finally put a name to the DNA Bradley John, everything about the case began to take shape. He wasn't any random traveler. He was a man with a past. Bradley was born in 1958 in Western Australia. To people who knew him, he was unpredictable, part truck driver, part mechanic, part drifter. He had a history of violence, a deep mistrust of authority, and a fascination with guns. In the Outback, he was known as one of those men who would fix your engine, share a drink, and then disappear for months without a trace. But in the late 90s, Bradley had drifted into drug trafficking, moving amphetamines along remote highways between Darwin and Perth. He preferred isolation, sleeping in his truck, traveling with his dog, and often carrying a weapon. Friends later told police that he had become increasingly paranoid. He convinced himself the police were following him and that anyone on the road could be an informant. When detectives began looking into his movement in July 2001, the coincidence was shocking. He had been seen near Barrow Creek at the time Peter Jonah had passed. His Toyota four-wheel drive matched Jonah's description, and his DNA, the one found on a t-shirt, was an exact match. In 2003, after 2 years of investigations, officers finally arrested him at his home in Broome. He denied everything. He said he had never seen Jonah, never heard of Peter, and never ever been to Barrow Creek that night. But when police searched his property, they found something that made denial difficulty. Photographs, vehicle parts, and maps of every stretch of road where the attack had happened. Still, Bradley stayed calm, almost too calm. In every interview, he kept repeating one line, saying, "They have got the wrong man." He refused to take the stand during hearings, refused to explain the DNA, and refused to show any emotions. To some, it was arrogance, to others, it was a strategy. The prosecution believed they had finally found the monster behind the desert mystery. But there was still one major problem, because there was no body. Without Peter's remains, the case would rely almost entirely on Jonah's testimony and forensic evidence. As the trial date approached in 2005, Australia waited. Could a man really be convicted of murder when there was no body to prove death, no weapon, and no witness except a terrified survivor? The trial would decide everything, and it would divide the country in ways no one expected. By the time Bradley Jones stood trial in Darwin in 2005, the case had become a national obsession. For 4 years, Australia had been haunted by a question that had no answer. Where is Peter Falconio? The prosecution, armed with forensic evidence, DNA reports, and one survivor's testimony. On the other hand, Bradley was calm, expressionless, a man who still claimed he was innocent. When Jonah took the stand, the air inside the courtroom shifted. She was asked to relive that night, every sound, every flash, every moment she thought she was about to die. Her voice trembled, but her words never broke. She pointed directly at Bradley and said, "That's the man who attacked us." The prosecution laid out a timeline with precision. Bradley's truck seen near Barrow Creek, his DNA found on Jonah's clothes and cable ties, his history with weapons and violence. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to fit. The defense lawyer pushed back hard. They argued that DNA could have been contaminated, that Jonah's memory had been distorted by trauma, and that without a body, there was no proof Peter Falconio was even dead. They painted Jonah was unreliable, the frightened girl who became a perfect witness because the real killer was never found. But the jury didn't believe it. After 7 weeks of testimony, the verdict came. Bradley John was found guilty of murder of Peter Falconio and the assault of Jonah. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 26 years before parole, meaning he will remain behind bars until 2033. For Jonah, it was justice but not closure, because to this day Peter Falconio's body was never been found. Bradley still refuses to stay where it is. He continues to claim that the police framed him, that his DNA was planted, and that he had nothing to do with that night. For Peter's family back in England, every year that passes without a body is another wound that never heals. And for Jonah, life after the trial had been a battle to reclaim normalcy, to be more than a woman who survived the desert. She wrote a book, gave interviews, and tried to move forward, but deep down, a part of her life will always be on that highway, still hearing the bang, still feeling the cold desert wind. 24 years later, Australian Outback still keeps its silence. No one knows where Peter Falconio remains lie. Maybe buried underneath the red desert, maybe hidden forever. But one thing is certain, the desert remembers. This was the story of Peter Falconio, the man who vanished and the woman who survived. I'm Sai from SPK Reports, unmasking crime one story at a time.